Yeah, well, you might know my father-in-law, Brian Mooney.
Oh, shit.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Good looking.
You too, yeah.
Good evening, friends. I am Michelle Clifton Soderstrom. I know most of you, but for those that I don't, I'm the Interim Dean of Faculty and Professor of Theology and Ethics here. And I am really delighted about our speaker, Dr. Thomas, but I'm going to let my colleague, David Sutton, introduce him in just a moment. And you were here in 2002, right? So welcome back. We're really glad to have you. The Palmquist Lectures, for people who aren't familiar with them, were established in 1985 by the family of Eldon Palmquist, who was a pastor and a superintendent in the Evangelical Covenant. And the lectureship was started in honor of his lively preaching, his love for education, and his passion for following Christ. So we're glad to have our speaker here tonight who follows in that kind of spirit of preaching as well. The schedule for the evening will be, we have the first hour for the lecture or sermon. I don't know how we're going to call it. And so we'll have about 45 minutes of presentation, and then Deborah Penny will do Q&A for 15 minutes. We'll have a half an hour break, and then we will come back from 8 to 9 for the second part of our evening. So let me open us with prayer. God, thank you for this place, this land, the people that you have put in this chapel tonight. And I pray that you would open our ears and our hearts and our minds and challenge us, speak to us, speak truth, and may we be receptive to what Dr. Thomas will bring us tonight. I pray for all of the concerns and the other things going on in our lives, and I pray that you would tend to those in peaceful ways so we could be here and be present to our evening together. We ask this through your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
I have the privilege of introducing one of my favorite professors of all time. Reverend Dr. Frank Anthony Thomas currently serves as the Nettie Sweeney and Hugh Thomas Miller Professor of Homiletics at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, Indiana. Adept in preaching method, a revised and updated version of They Like to Never Quit Praising God, The Role of Celebration in Preaching, was released in August 2013, considered by many to be a classic. For many years, Thomas has also taught preaching to doctoral and master's level students at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois, and at Memphis Theological Seminary in Memphis, Tennessee. He is the CEO of Hope for Life International Incorporated, which formerly published the African American Pulpit, with a long history of excellence in preaching and preaching method, American Preaching by Abingdon Press, November 2016. American Dream 2.0, A Christian Way Out of the Great Recession, Abingdon Press, August 2012. He also co-edited Preaching with Sacred Fire, an anthology of African American sermons, 1750 to the present, with Martha Simmons, published by W.W. Norton and Company in 2010. This critically acclaimed book offers a rare view of the unheralded role of the African American preacher in American history. Dr. Thomas' book, The Choice, Living Your Passion Inside Out, published by Hope for Life International Press, October 2013. Thomas is also the author of several other books on subjects from matters of prayers to spiritual maturity. Dr. Thomas served with the distinction as the senior pastor for two remarkable congregations, New Faith Baptist Church of Matteson, Illinois, and Mississippi Boulevard Christian Church of Memphis, Tennessee, for 18 years and 13 years, respectively. Dr. Thomas holds a PhD in Communications Rhetoric from the University of Memphis, a Doctor of Divinity from Christian Theological Seminary, a Doctor of Ministry degrees from Chicago Theological Seminary and United Theological Seminary, a Master of Divinity from Chicago Theological Seminary and a Master of Arts in African Caribbean Studies from Northeastern Illinois University. A very sharp mind, as you can see. Dr. Thomas and his wife, the Reverend Dr. Joyce Scott Thomas, each earned their Certified Professional Coaching Certificate from the Institute for Professional Excellence in Coaching. And while they are equipped to coach in corporate, executive, business, life, personal, or group settings, they are most passionate about enabling pastors and pastors' spouses, as well as coaching in the area of preaching. Dr. Thomas is nationally and internationally sought after keynote speaker and lecturer. Thomas and his wife have 2 adult children. I hear a new grandchild. And so put your hands together for this brilliant mind, Dr. Frank Thomas. Amen.
Thank you all. Thank you. If I knew that introduction was going to be that long, I'd have had him cut it. The introduction is longer than the lecture, you know. It is my privilege to be gathered with you all in this place. I have wonderful memories. I was here in 2002 and danced around with Klein Snodgrass and some stuff together. And so it's just really good to be here and really good to share with you all. And David, thank you so much for the hospitality, picking me up, getting me here. I do want you all to pray that I can get out of here and get home. I do need prayer. It looks bad for tomorrow. United Airlines sent me a little text and said, you know, we're willing to change your flight and, you know, adjust the fees if you would like. So I took that as a sign to ask you all for prayer. I had just had fellowship with some of the faculty, the dean, interim dean, and thank you all for the hospitality. Really great to be with you all. I want to grapple with this theme, the gift and the grace of African American preaching. What do these words mean? I wrote this because August 2/19 is a commemoration, or was the commemoration, of 400 years of African people being brought in the transatlantic slave trade to America, and hence the onset of the African American experience. Though some scholars argue that Africans, as part of the African diaspora, were in the Americas long before 1619, I want to leave that discussion for another time. And for the sake of discussion on this night, utilize as a very important date, 1619, even if it's not the earliest dates, Africans were in the Americas. What do these 400 years of African American presence mean? What does it mean for African Americans? What does it mean for all Americans? Does it mean for those of the human family or the entire human family that Africans were brought to these distant shores? It is important to, first of all, mention that millions died on slave ships in the Middle Passage. Between 1500 and 1866, reliable estimates suggest that 12.5 million African captives were brought. Estimates vary, but conservatively, we can say that 2 million died in the Middle Passage. They died in the journey to get to America, and their bodies were thrown overboard into the Atlantic. In memory of these 2 million, I want to introduce you to Aunt Esther. Aunt Esther is the almost 400-year-old spiritual healer who has a crucial role in African-American playwright August Wilson's African American Century series. Wilson wrote a play for each decade of the 20th century. Aunt Esther dies at the age of 366 in his 8th play of the series. She takes a young man named Mr. Citizen, which is symbolic of black folks struggling with citizenship after Reconstruction, the sellout of Reconstruction, and the onset of Jim Crow. She takes Mr. Citizen on a pilgrimage to the Middle Passage to visit the City of Bones, where 2 million African ancestors who died in transit built. It was a beautiful city made of bones that could wash his soul of guilt and sorrow. Aunt Esther says, take a look at this map, Mr. Citizen. See that right there? That's a city. It's only a half mile by a half mile, but that's a city. It's made of bones, pearly white bones. All the buildings and everything is made of bones. I seen it. I've been there, Mr. Citizen. My mother lives there. I got an aunt and 3 uncles down there in that city made up of bones. You want to go there, Mr. Citizen? I can take you there if you want to go. That's the center of the world. In time, it will all come to light. The people made a kingdom out of nothing. They were people that didn't make it across the water. They sat right down there and said, hey, let's make a kingdom. Let's make a city of bones. I came across that ocean, Mr. Citizen. I cried. I had lost everything. Everything I had ever known in this life, I lost that. I cried an ocean of tears. Did you ever lose anything like that, Mr. Citizen? Where you so lost, the only thing that could guide you is the stars? That's all I had left. Everything I'd ever known was gone to me. The only thing I had was the stars. Well, I say, I got something. I wanted to hold on to them, so I started naming them. I named them after my children. I say, there goes Cephas, there goes Jasper, that's Cecilia over there, and the big one over there, that's Junebug. You ever look at the stars, Mr. Citizen? I bet you seen my Junebug and didn't even know it. Now that you met her, she speaks to why I'm here. And she speaks to the ministry that I've given the last years of my life to. Aunt Esther says to Mr. Citizen, I'm on an adventure I've been on since I was 9 years old. Miss Tyler gave me her name. My mama sent me to live with Miss Tyler. I don't tell nobody. I don't tell nobody my real name. Miss Tyler passed me this name, Esther. I want to pass on to you. I want to pass on to you. I want to pass on to you, but people say it's too much to carry. I told myself somebody's got to carry it. Miss Esther carried it right up till the day she died. I didn't run from it. I got a long memory, and I ain't afraid to remember. I got memories. I'm carrying them for a lot of folk, all the old-timey folks. I'm carrying their memories, and I'm carrying my own. If you don't want it, I got to find somebody else. I'm getting old, going on 300 years. I've got to find somebody. I don't know how much time I got left. I tell you that because I am here because I have strong memory. I've got long memory. People say, you're crazy to remember, but I ain't afraid to remember. I try to remember out loud. I write to remember. I keep my memories alive. I keep memories alive. I carry the memory and the wisdom of my ancestors. Aunt Esther said the ancestors were looking for people to carry the wisdom. I carry the wisdom of the ancestors. I carry the best of black preachers and the embodied wisdom of the ancestors. That's what I've given my life to. That's why I'm a professor of preaching. That's why I write books on African American preaching to distribute, to keep going and passing the wisdom of the ancestors. I want to look at these questions that I've asked from the perspective, as I said, of black preaching in the voice of the ancestors. I want to tell you what the ancestors say about black preaching since we've been doing it for 400 years in this country almost. What the ancestors say about what preaching means for African American, what the ancestors say about what preaching means for all Americans, what the ancestors say that black preaching means for the whole human family. All the ancestors had was words, pictures, images, and songs. All preachers have are words and images and pictures and song. I come to tell you what these words mean, what the words of the black preacher mean, what the voice of the ancestors. Let me start by suggesting what Martha Simmons and I wrote in our book entitled Preaching with Sacred Fire, an anthology of African American preaching from 1750 to the present. We said that given the span and scope of the continued tragic, torturous, and yet triumphant history of blacks in North America, the black church, as the spiritual foundation of the black community, has been the main initiators of freedom and emancipation for African American people. Black religion and black religious institutions have been the most vital and vibrant instruments of black survival and liberation. And absolutely critical to the leadership of the black church was the leadership of some of the most imaginative and skilled leaders, orators, and preachers in history. Black preachers, the voices of the ancestors, speaking the memory of the ancestors. I know the stereotypes of black preachers that we're all familiar with based upon the movies and the media. How else could it be, given the importance of the black preachers to the church and the importance of the church to the community? It could be a sign of flattery that so much fun is made of the black preacher. Images such as James Brown playing the preacher in the Blues Brothers, black preachers as buffoons, backslapping, slipping and sliding, words mispronouncing, exaggerated dress as comic relief for the masses. And then there are the more hurtful stereotypes as money hungry, women chasing, or as the Temptations say in their song, Papa Was a Rolling Stone, that the preacher is dealing in dirt and stealing in the name of the Lord. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the very best of black preaching. I'm talking about some of the garden variety of black preaching that ain't worth talking about. What is worth your time and your attention is the very highest and best. Martha Simmons and I wrote these words of the preachers who were the best voices of the ancestors, even during the most difficult and oppressive times. The delivery, creativity, charisma, expressivity, fervor, forcefulness, passion, persuasiveness, poise, power, rhetoric, spirit, style, and vision of black preaching gave and gives hope to a community under siege. Slavery used as breeding machines, free labor for 250 years, racism, hatred, bigotry, lynching, the Civil War, being whipped, voter suppression, Jim Crow, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, the war on drugs, black women as welfare queens, the Southern strategy, mass incarceration, police violence, have all been addressed with words. All the ancestors and preachers had was words. What do these words mean? What is the meaning of these words? As a scholar, it is important to define terms. I want to quickly define by grappling with a few questions. What is the black church? That's the first question. The ancestors say the black church was formed as a response and opportunity for free and enslaved African Americans to meet and interpret the God of Scripture from the unique vantage point of their oppressed social location and believe that God was actively involved in their quest for spiritual and political freedom and liberation. Most of the white church preached the gospel of support for slavery, telling slaves that they must, quote unquote, must be obedient to their masters. They must pray for the authorities that God has set over them. And the Ham doctrine, that classic doctrine of the white church, where black people as the sons of Ham were cursed by God and by divine fiat meant to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. The black church believed none of it and turned over to Exodus, where God told Moses, tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. The black church discovered the God of liberation, and as a result, for the most part, a healing spirituality and ethic for black people, grounded not only in the Exodus, but also in Genesis, believing that they were created in the image of God. Question 2, is the black church still necessary? Ancestors say that proven for 400 years in this country the ability of white supremacy to creatively mutate to ensure the continued social, cultural, political, economic, and religious dominance of black and brown people. The track record says, for over 400 years in this country, the ability of white supremacy to creatively mutate to ensure the continued social, cultural, political, economic, and religious dominance of black and brown people in American life. And so for the sake of Christ, for the sake of sanity, health, and motivation to work for freedom and healing, it is vitally necessary that some still identify their church as black. White supremacy and its concomitants of denial, distraction, ignorance, and innocence and hate are so pervasive, it is necessary to create a spiritual and physical place where the images, tone, mood, concerns, joys, sorrows of black people can be taken seriously. The black church is sanctuary, a refuge for psychological, spiritual, and even physical healing. The black church offers an identity in God above and beyond the racist tropes and the white supremacist images of American culture in many forms and manifestations. It is important to say that not all churches made up of black people identify themselves as black. Churches are very diverse as to how they prioritize the interpretation of Scripture, evangelism, the relationship between the spiritual life and social change, and their identity in Jesus Christ. I do not throw shade on how churches self-identify. I believe that every church has the right to self-identify as it will. But I'd like to make clear that I self-identify as being a family member of the black church and unequivocally a black preacher. Well, what is black preaching? Black preaching is a genre and a style of preaching derived from a cultural history originating in West Africa based in an oral tradition of the spoken word and oral transmission of tales, music, dance, proverbs, beliefs, sermons, rather than the written and textual tradition of Western culture. Black preaching coheres around at least 7 characteristics, and I'm adding 8 tonight, because I'm working on writing 8. Number 1 is the centrality of the Bible. This is not to be mistaken for a rigid biblical literalism. The Bible is seen as the inspired and dynamic source for understanding the world and the wise guide for life's decisions. In the words of Professor Cleo LaRue, the Bible is the single most important source of truth, language, imagery, and story for the sermon. Second characteristic, the importance of experiential preaching. The Bible comes alive by means of an eyewitness style of picture painting and narration. The preacher stirs the 5 senses, and as a result, the hearer does not just hear about John the Baptist in past biblical times. John the Baptist is in the room, present, seen, heard, touched, and felt by all. Dr. James Forbes tells the story when Dr. Gardner Calvin Taylor was preaching. Dr. Taylor was preaching the prodigal son. Dr. Taylor got to the point in the sermon where the boy was coming home. Dr. Taylor from the pulpit pointed and said, "Look, the boy's coming up the road right now." Dr. Forbes said he turned around and saw the boy coming up through the door. That's called experiential. Third is existential exegesis. This means African American preaching operates from the perspective of a close observation of the Bible and human need, which directs the sermon to resolve existential concern by exegesis of the text. Exegesis of the black sermon joins biblical scholarship to existential human need. Number 4, the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. The preacher is dependent on a power beyond the preacher's power. The Holy Spirit ultimately shapes and delivers the message through the preacher. The sermon is not simply the words of a human being, but the very voice of God speaking through the preacher. Number 5, Suspense that leads to celebration. The preacher structures the sermon to hold suspense as long as possible, and after the suspense is resolved, the preacher celebrates the good news with a powerful and uplifting conclusion. The weight that the black church places on a powerful conclusion to a message is unparalleled in any culture I've seen. And I've seen a few. 6, call and response, nature of the sermon. Call and response refers to the interaction, we just did it a few minutes ago, between preachers and congregations that allows the audience to partner in shaping and directing the sermon. The preacher speaks and the congregation speaks back. And together in that dialogue, the pace, the tone, the content of the sermon is more fully developed. Number 7, the performative nature of the sermon. The Word of God must be embodied and performed in the total person of the preacher, including head, which is rationality, heart, emotionality, and the body, physicality. The African American sermon is unapologetically performed. And then number 8, hope. The ability out of the deepest and most evil situations and circumstances of life to believe that God is good and there is hope, even if that hope has to be eschatological. It has to do with the moral imagination. So here is Aunt Esther on a journey to the Middle Passage. She's lost everything. She's out on a ship in the middle of the night, left her country, and she looks up and says, well, at least I got the stars. And she names her children. There goes Cephas. There goes Junebug. Hope. What is the biggest challenge to the black church? The biggest challenge to the black church and black preaching is to deal with white supremacy in America. It has always been and will always be, as long as we are black in America. White supremacy is the fundamental belief that black and brown people and women are inferior and therefore second-class citizens and not entitled to all of the rights and privileges and the responsibilities of every other American. White supremacy has always been the biggest challenge of African American people in this nation. In truth, the ritual and benefit of freedom in America has always been restricted to a few certain privileged groups within the American culture. And many people are marginalized and excluded from being Americans. While we must acknowledge that progress has been made, we must also acknowledge that freedom has been painfully slow. American rituals and benefits of freedom have been intended for a few because certain groups were considered less than Americans and other. Hence the oppressive and dismissive language of take our country back. And now that we got our country back, send them back. And the denying of certain groups of people as real Americans. The ancestors say that I mentioned to you the roots of black preaching. While some believe that slaves were blank tablets where cultural practices and memories were erased upon the sojourn in America, it is clear that Africans in America, African Americans, retain traditional belief systems. They had African faiths beyond Christianity, including Islam and African traditional religions. There was enough commonality in tribes to extract core beliefs and one Negro African consciousness, and yet a fair amount of differences based upon the oppressive experience of the American continent. One overarching aspect of the consciousness was a liberation faith rather than the spiritual subservience that the master taught. Whatever their faith, liberation was a central component. Another was a great respect for the power of words, myths, folk tales, oral telling over the written text. Zora Neale Hurston articulates that this is different than the cultural history of the Western world, which is principally preserved and transmitted based upon the written word and hence could be called textual. Third was the role of serious verbal engagement with the audience, what again we know as call and response. Zora Neale Hurston I don't know if you're familiar with Zora Neale Hurston, writer, folklorist, genius of the South. She articulates characteristics of Negro expression. That when black people talk, whether it's rap, preaching, singing, that there are characteristics, and she articulates a theory of black narration, inclusive of all African American oral telling, characteristics of Negro expression. She says the words of African Americans are action words and not principally abstractions. The African American's very interpretation of the English language is in pictures, which results in rich metaphor and simile. She believes that pictures are easier to explain because action came before speech. She argues that when the African American preacher talks, they see the picture in their mind of the object in use, for example, a chair, and they describe what they see. For example, Euro-Americans use abstractions from chair to chairness. What makes the African American preacher so gripping is that from African American culture, African culture, the preacher sees the picture and they describe the picture that they see. And it's different when you describe the abstraction that you see. Hurston admits that much of this has been influenced by the acculturation of African Americans to mainstream American life. It has been influenced by that, yes, but oral traditions still heavily remain. Secondly, she says, whenever black people act in their own interests and as an expression of the conscious black self, the action is embellished. We can't just dunk. We have to show enough dunk. We have to turn around and dunk, flip through the air and dunk. She says embellishment. She suggests that black religious services are prose poetry and the prayers and sermons are polished until they are true works of art. The beauty of the Old Testament does not exceed that of a Negro prayer. Drama is natural and inherent part of the African American life in America, and therefore African American expression is naturally inherently performative and rhetorical. Negro expression, she said, at its best is filled with poetry, imagery, metaphor, simile, and word pictures summarized in her terms. Drama, illustration, and the will to adorn. Preaching is our main focus, so I have set Hurston's characteristics in terms of preaching. Drama. The preacher's words are action words and interpretations of the English language in terms of pictures. Western culture thinks in language. African American thinks in word pictures like the hieroglyphics of ancient Egypt. Secondly, illustration. The preacher uses vivid illustration because it's easier to illustrate than explain, because action came before speech. The words of African Americans are action words and not principally abstractions. And third, the will to adorn. The preacher decorates and embroiders narration with figurative language with the intent to satisfy the desire for beauty in the preacher and the congregation's soul. Hurston foregrounds in many of her works, particularly Their Eyes Were Watching God and Jonas Vingegaard, the personhood, struggle, and yet beautiful and poetic language of these dramatic, often unlettered preachers. So much so that she was criticized for emphasizing preachers and their sermons as literary and rhetorical devices. The New York Times reviewed Jonas Vingegaard and said that John Pearson's final sermon was too good, too brilliantly splashed with poetic imagery to be the product of any one Negro preacher. Hurston responds in a letter written to James Weldon Johnson, there are hundreds of preachers who are equaling that sermon weekly. The preacher must also be an artist. He or she must be a poet and an actor of a very high order. They are the first artists, the ones intelligible to the masses. In a May 12 letter to Louis Gannett, who reviewed Jonas Gord for the New York Herald Tribune, she writes, "The greatest poets among us are in our pulpits, and the greatest poetry has come out of them. It is merely not set down. It passes from mouth to mouth as in the days of Homer." Hurston emphasized the originality and the artfulness of black expression, noting it can be compared to Homer, the first and greatest of the epic poets and other noted sources of the Western canon. As I start to head to my seat, I'm not going there yet, I'm just starting in that direction. I want to get to these questions I asked now with that as background. What do these words mean to African American people? In my book, How to Preach a Dangerous Sermon, I call it moral imagination. Here is a section that I wrote in the book. Many would call preaching from moral imagination prophetic preaching or preaching from prophetic imagination. Walter Brueggemann correctly and pointedly declares that the prophet brings to light public expressions of those very hopes and yearnings that have been denied so long and suppressed so deeply. Brueggemann further explains prophetic imagination by alluding to a novel entitled Imagining Argentina. The key character, Carlos Rueda, has the miraculous gift of creating futures by acts of anticipatory imagination. Brueggemann quotes Imagining Argentina. Confronted with evidence of the miraculous, Carlos's friends nevertheless remain skeptical, convinced that Carlos cannot confront tanks with stories, helicopters with mere imagination. They only can see the conflict in terms of fantasy versus reality. Carlos, on the other hand, rightly grasps that the contest is not between imagination and the real, but between two types of imagination, that of the generals and that of their opponents. The nightmare world of torture and disappearance of bodies is inseparable from the general's imagination of what Argentina and Argentinese, I have a cold, so let me sing it. The people of Argentina are. Carlos envisioned that his imagination was stronger than the imagination of the state. In writing this book, these words are exactly my sentiment. The moral imagination of a world of peace and justice is stronger than white supremacy's imagination of who and what we are. The ancestors say that all we have is words, and imaginative words are stronger than racism, nativism. That's what these words mean to African American people, to create the imagination, the moral imagination, that the future of peace and justice and a multicultural and multiracial and multigender place is stronger than white supremacy's imagination, racism, nativism. What do these words mean for all Americans? In a poem entitled Democracy, protesting the lack of democracy for African American people, Langston Hughes, a prolific African American poet of the Harlem Renaissance, wrote of freedom, "Freedom is a strong seed planted in a great need." What Hughes meant, at least in part, is that freedom is deeply planted in the hearts and the imagination of those who have been denied freedom and equality. There is a basic and perverse strain of self-preservation in human beings that those who do have freedom protect their privilege, not just against tyranny, but also from others in a society deemed unworthy of the rituals and the benefits of freedom. Human nature tends to conserve and constrict freedom and equality to the benefit of one's own group. However, that group forms around morals or politics or economics or race, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, region, or religion. It is human nature to limit freedom to one's group and be perfectly contented that freedom is limited, restricted, and privileged to a few. As human beings, we often rationalize and blame the lack of freedom on fate or some innocuous fault, deficiency, or flaw in the character, person, humanity, individually or collectively of the unfree. For the most part, the moral imagination of the free is limited. And the practical result, based upon that limitation, is a culture and nation where only a few lives matter. In a strange twist of fate, freedom is kept free by the moral imagination of those who do not have the ritual and benefits of freedom. Freedom is kept free by the moral imagination of those by sentiments and actions of protest continue to push, prod, poke, and break the boundaries and the preset limits of freedom. If we are looking for an example, I might suggest that America would still have segregation and signs of white and colored without the civil rights movement. America had to be carried kicking and screaming every inch of the way by the sacrifice, blood, and the death of many innocent people to move America toward freedom and equality for all in the mid-20th century. Therefore, if we're looking for freedom, it is important to look at the moral imagination of the marginalized, disenfranchised, and vulnerable in any society and culture, along with those who have the moral imagination to understand, empathize, and work for the freedom of those outside of their group. My chief concern is it takes moral imagination to envision freedom for more than ourselves or our particular group. Because of such a lack of moral imagination, freedom and equality are often found wanting and sorely lacking in American culture and society, and around the globe for that matter. What does it mean to the human race that black people came to America 400 years ago? I'm going to call two witnesses to the stand. It might be that I'm a child of the 60s and forever locked in a nostalgic time warp. I carry the idealism, the hope, the horror, the grief, and the disappointment of the 1960s. At the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott movement in 1955, Martin Luther King Jr. said that if black people marched nonviolently and in Christian love, that when history books were written in future generations, historians would have to pause and say that a great race of black people lived who exhibited moral courage and stood up for their rights, thereby imbuing a new meaning into the world. Though I was 11 years old when King was killed, I believed it. If you will protest courageously and yet with dignity and Christian love, when the history books are written in future generations, the historians will have to pause and say, there lived a great people, a black people who injected new meaning and dignity into the veins of civilization. I believe it. I want to call then, secondly, W.E.B. Du Bois to the stage. As far as Du Bois could see, the only Americans who practiced way of Christ Christianity, humility, and nonviolence were black Americans. Du Bois thought that white Americans asserted themselves and took possession. This was understandable, he said, as a rebound from European oppression. Moreover, he appreciated that white Americans built up a vital, bustling, and prosperous nation. On the other hand, white American self-assertion was, in many of its aspects, a dangerous and an awful thing. It hardens and hurts our souls. It contradicts our philanthropy and religion. Black Americans had a gift to offer in this area. It was the gift, he said, that black folk had long offered to the New World. This is what he said. Thus, in the singular and the final sense, the slave became master, the bondservant became free, and the meek not only inherited the earth, but made a heritage, a thing of questing for eternal youth, of fruitful labor, of joy and music, of the free spirit and the ministering hand, of sympathy with people in their struggle to live and love, which is, after all, the end of being. he said, African Americans gave to America and the whole human race the gift of being fully human. We talk a lot today about black theologies. I want a liberating white theology. I want a white theology that speaks to Appalachia. This is Ruby Sales. Don't let me take the credit. I'm quoting Ruby Sales. You know, y'all are saying, wow, this is if Ruby Sales in a piece called Where Does It Hurt? It's up in NPR. You can get it. Google it. She says, I want a theology that speaks to Appalachia. I want a theology that begins to deepen people's understanding of their capacity to live fully human lives and to touch the goodness inside of themselves rather than to call upon the part of themselves that is not relational. Because there is nothing wrong with being European American. That's not the problem. It's how you actualize that history. Now, let me stop there because I'll start more. Thank you so much. Was that a lot?
I'm sorry, I was trying to hurry up with writing my notes. Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, for your lecture. I truly appreciate it personally. But now it's not about me. It's about opening the floor for questions or comments.
Can I unpack that last comment that I made before you're on go?
Certainly may.
Ruby Sales' argument is that we don't have a solution to the capitalist technocracy. And so because the church has no answer for Appalachia, the white church, for example, has no answer. We don't speak to that reality. She argues then that people believe that Trump is speaking for their reality. But the fact is that the church doesn't have an ability to speak to that reality. And she said, so she's looking for a white liberation theology that speaks to people, that helps make them fully human, versus this other stuff where it's the Mexicans, it's the immigrants, it's you blaming somebody else for your problem, and you scapegoating people. And so the church, while it's sexy to talk about a black liberation theology, that we also need a white liberation theology.
Thank you. And please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. I'm Dennis Edwards. I teach New Testament here at the seminary. I very much appreciate your lecture. My question relates to, you mentioned the passion and even the celebratory nature of black preaching.
Yes.
I want to, if you may, address the topic of anger. My struggle is, I'm just doing some of my own writing, but you know the critique
Yes.
that comes with being passionate. How do you perhaps include that or not in preaching?
I'm going to do a piece later that James Baldwin says, to be a Negro in America and to be at least half conscious is to live in a continual state of rage. So can we hold that till the second part? Because you'll hear me grappling with it. Thank you for that question. That is a question that we often don't. Brittany Cooper has a book called Eloquent Rage, talking about the rage of black women. And Christian Rage, a friend of mine in South Africa, is writing on is it appropriate for Christians to have rage, and what kind of rage?
Hi, I'm Carrie Stevens. I'm an MDiv student here. You touched on a whole bunch of really powerful tools that African American preachers use, and I am wondering, as someone who is white and wants to be a good preacher, how can white preachers use, first of all, can white preachers use those techniques without it being cultural appropriation? And if so, how do you recommend or not recommend that? I don't know.
Thank you for your culturally sensitive question. I appreciate that. The way that I view it, I don't view it as black people over in a corner talking about we're the better preachers. I think that our experience got us to some things faster. And so the goal is now to offer that to the entire human community. And there are many white preachers. They're fine white preachers. One of my favorites is Fred Craddock. Fred Craddock, I wrote an article on Fred Craddock and black preaching. So I think in every group there are wonderful preachers, and probably some of the very same characteristics would come up. Story, metaphor, picture, to able to paint a picture versus abstractions, or abstractions that are written into the hearts of people through a picture or an image. So I think it can be, yes, I don't think it's not proprietary to black people. I just think our experience pushes us. So for example, the rage that we consistently live with, what do we do with that rage? So for example, let's take lynching. What did the preachers preach the Sunday after a kid was lynched? And all the black people came inside. So now in the academic world, we'll call that preaching to cultural trauma, right? Which is what it is. The preacher has to find some hope. The community is wrestling for hope. So I think through the experience, that's why I say that freedom is kept free, not by the people who are already free, because the human tendency is to restrict it. You want to find freedom, find the people who've been left out. They're always pushing the boundaries and keeping freedom fresh. Because when we get freedom, we conserve it to our group. So when you go out to the margins and you find people, you find some amazing things. And so what I try to do is just write it up, because so much of our genius goes to the grave because it's not written up. In an oral culture, transmitted orally, sometimes the wisdom goes to the grave. So I'm really a scribe. That's how I look at myself. To scribe a tradition so that it goes in writing and it lasts, versus so much of our genius goes to the grave. So I'm trying to, this is how we got to develop a piece. This is a whole lot more than what you asked me, but I'm rambling. This is how we got to start a PhD program in African American preaching, because we needed scribes for this tradition, because so much of the genius goes to the grave, and we don't have scribes. So I'm really a scribe. I tried to articulate that, maybe not well, as a responsibility to carry the voice of the ancestors. So that's my life's work now, and where I'm focused for the rest of my ministry and the rest of my life is I'm dedicated to this tradition. And so, for example, we formed as the mission statement of the PhD program, African American Preaching, The genius, the power, the depth, and the beauty of African American preaching will generate a preaching renaissance to revive American Christianity in the 21st century. And American Christianity is desperate need of revival. And we believe that black preaching can have a voice, a hand, a push, a prod. So it's really sending it out there, hoping that you'll take some and learn from it and improve. And it's not a kind of top down, we over here in the corner, we the best preachers. You know, y'all can't preach like us, you know. Y'all may have had a big churches, but y'all can't preach like, no, that's silly, you know. It's open. I hopefully, we can discuss this, that the lecture was delivered invitationally rather than another kind of way. Now, you know you're going to get a long answer, so just be ready for it.
My name's Tiana Coleman. I'm in the MDiv program here. And I was just curious, you said you were 11 when Martin Luther King died. More than anything, I'm just curious as to how that impacted you. You said you believed his words, but you know, just given the path that you took, and you know, I was born in '75, so of course that's like,
right, yeah,
you know,
exactly.
way before, you know, not way before me, but before me.
Right.
And so I'm just curious as to how, like, yeah, you navigated that as a kid, but just how that impacted you overall in what you're doing now and life in general.
Well, I was 11, so I never really fully understood the real impact because I was 11. You know, I saw the rioting. I knew that the schools were closing. You know, my parents kept trying to explain it to me, and it really was not until I took a class with Albert Pete Perro over at the Lutheran School of Theology in 22 years old in seminary. I wrote a paper and said that Martin Luther King was not revolutionary. Malcolm X was a real revolutionary. Mm-hmm. Pete Perro called me to his office and chewed my behind from front to back. He did. He chewed me out. He made me read this, made me read that. Well, you know, what are you talking? This man, what are you talking about, right? I think I framed it that way because I think that we are, and I'll take ideas as we are fairly trapped, or can be, by the era in which we're born. Yeah. And the 60s was a tremendous time of change and hope, at least initially for African American people. Later on in the 60s, Black Power rose, a whole different thing came up. But there was a period that many black people thought we could change this nation. We believed him. That quote I gave you, that if we will march nonviolently and in love, that civilization will one day say, that lived the great black people. Maybe it was just my parents. So that kind of optimism, I still carry it. So I have a tremendous level of pain with what's going on now. It's the optimism. If I didn't have the optimism, I wouldn't have the pain. If I had cynicism, I'd just say, well, you know. But the optimism, and then the other side too, back to the optimism also leads to rage. So maybe that's why I wrote, maybe I'm stuck in the 60s, but I believed it. She opened the door, so I thought that meant.
Okay, so how about maybe.
So, myself, Obaid, and I am a PhD student. Mm-hmm. I am pursuing my doctorate in theology.
Okay.
Subaltern theology, not white theology. So, but I work at the Covenant offices, and I'm the staff at the Covenant. So, I work with the church planting movement. So, my question to you, sir, is when you concluded that there is a need of white liberation theology.
Yes.
So can you please elaborate on it, how it would look like liberation from black theological critics, or or liberation, white liberation from being white moderate, or promoting KKK agenda? What kind of liberation you are seeking?
Thank
So
you.
can you please elaborate on
Oh,
it?
yeah,
Thank you.
thank you so much. That's a great question. I believe that capitalism is the unseen God of American life. And I believe that because we cannot critique capitalism, so when the factories close and in towns, let's take towns in small America. The problems at small towns in America and problem in ghetto, black neighborhoods are the same, in the inner city, the same things. Lack of resources, so when the plant closes down and the whole community gets a job, and they take that plant to Mexico because the labor is cheaper, they can't critique capitalism. So somebody comes in and say, it's the Mexicans, they taking your jobs. They got to do with the Mexicans. They're every bit as much of a victim of it as you are. So I'm looking for a critique. We can't critique capitalism, which means we can't critique the real. That's why I said Ruby Sell called it a capital technocracy. A capitalistic, we can't critique it. We can't say that money is global and it moves, it has no national identity, it moves where it can make more money. So instead of blaming blacks for taking the jobs or Mexicans for taking the job, why can't we speak to Appalachia and have a critique of that such that, but we don't, either we say nothing, or the white church in particular, either it says nothing, or the other side of it is, this is the greatest country in the world, God bless America, God made it, God made capitalism, and everything we do is right. There's no, so the name that I'm looking for liberative faith, a faith that liberates. And if you in a tradition, whatever, let's say you're purple, what needs liberating in your tradition, and how would you speak to it? But see, all the liberation stuff is put on black people. It's a black liberation, or it's a Latin American liberation. We don't talk about a white liberation theology. I mean, I have a critique that whiteness, only a few people in the country have access to whiteness. There are a lot of white people that don't have access to whiteness. There's a lot of white people that can't take their kids to the doctor. So while we like to think of it as the hood and the inner city, there's a lot of people who are left out in this capitalistic technocracy that we live in. You mean I can't take, it infuriates me. So here you are a senator or a president of somebody, and you got the best health care in the world. My taxes are paying your health care, but you're not willing to get health care so that everybody can take their kid. Why would you want for your kid, you wouldn't put your kid in a cage. Why put somebody else's kid in a cage? I mean, I don't get it. I'm missing something. Unless lack of empathy, callous, or supremacy. So because we can't critique that, we're running around here saying stuff like, we don't need government health care. I'm not advocating this. We don't need government health care. Then we get the election comes, so they dog whistle Obamacare. Then they find out that ACA, they said, well, we like ACA, but we don't like Obamacare. Then they find out, then they run, we're going to take away Obamacare. Then after the election, people jump up, you can't take my health care, because they discovered the ACA and Obamacare is the same thing. It's absurd. Because people don't have the tools to critique the real issue. And so they're given scapegoats and slogans. And you can't take your kid to the doctor, but you don't want no government health care. How you, I'm sorry.
Well, the hour is late.
Let me say this too, and maybe government health care is that's not the only solution, but if we would put our minds together, maybe we could imagine a different kind of healthcare system where everybody could take their kid to the doctor.
And that's the bottom line. Everyone can take their kid to
Thank
the
you.
doctor.
Thank you so much.
Paul, you're narrating the online. Did you have a question? And then I'm going to... Okay. Okay. Then I am going to bring it to a close. The time is
Could you
running.
share what the fight is about? I understand. I understand. Okay.
Okay. All right, so it is now break time, and when should we? Till 8? Yeah. Well, you heard, we'll start back up at 8. Enjoy the break. Thank you.
almost called him Dr. Sutton. Dr. Thomas, we have 2 doctors in the room, so thank you and welcome back.
Thank you so much for the warm dialogue. It's been just really good to be with you all and share ideas and things. And I caught a head cold, so I'm slower in my thinking processes. I want to do a sermon. And so we'll see how much different that is than what I was just doing, but it's entitled Get Home Safe. And the text is in Genesis 4:11 through 16. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. But the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Would you just bow with me? God, now we thank you for what we've already experienced. We ask you to get the glory. You be the preacher. We're careful to give you every ounce of the praise. In Christ's name, amen. The murder of Laquan McDonald took place on October 20th, 2014 in Chicago, Illinois, when 17-year-old African-American male Laquan McDonald was fatally shot 16 times by Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke. McDonald was reported to have been behaving erratically while walking down the street and holding a folding knife with a 3-inch blade. Initially, internal police reports described the incident similarly and ruled the shooting justified, and Van Dyke was not charged. When the courts forced the police department to release dashcam video of the shooting 13 months later, it showed McDonald had been walking away from the police officer when he was shot. That same day, Officer Van Dyke was charged with first-degree murder and was eventually released on bail. The city reached a financial settlement with the McDonald family. Fast forward to October 5, 2018, Van Dyke was found guilty at a jury trial of second-degree murder, as well as 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm. Van Dyke's defense team asked the judge to sentence Van Dyke to probation on the second-degree murder conviction alone, while prosecutors argued that he should also be sentenced on second-degree murder and all 16 counts. The maximum for those convictions could be as high as 96 years, but prosecutors asked the judge for 18 to 20 years. On the day that the judge pronounced the sentence, Van Dyke, 40 years old, arrived at the courthouse and addressed the court saying he prays daily for the soul of Laquan McDonald and that the teen's family was suffering, he was praying for that due to his actions. He said he opened fire because he feared for his life and that killing McDonald was the last thing he ever wanted to do. He remarked that he was a God-fearing man and a father, and he would live with it for the rest of his life. There were both family members and friends of Laquan McDonald and Jason Van Dyke that addressed the judge before sentencing. Edward Nance and several others testified to the abuse that they had suffered at the hands of Van Dyke. Citizen complaints against Van Dyke were not allowed to be entered into the trial. Prosecutors called 4 witnesses, all African-American men, who testified that Van Dyke was abusive and out-of-control officer and was protected by incompetent police oversight agencies. He was accused of using racial slurs, and Nance wept uncontrollably as he testified that Van Dyke pulled him out of a car after and described him as her everything, her other half, her heart, a great human being, a great father, and a wonderful husband. Tiffany Van Dyke said she echoed other family members who testified that her husband is not racist, or is he full of hatred. She said her 2 daughters don't eat or sleep and get bullied at school by kids who label their father as a murderer. She said her family feels threats and fears for their safety. She began to sob and in deep anguish said, "My biggest fear is that somebody would kill my husband for something he did as a police officer, something he was trained to do." There was no malice, no hatred on that night. He was simply doing his job. When asked what she would say to the McDonald family, she said her family prays for them, and she called McDonald's death a tragedy. She wanted both sides to have peace. She begged the judge for a lenient sentence, saying her husband would never work again and had already paid the ultimate price. Such is the complexity of our text when it says, "And Cain killed Abel, his brother." This difficult text in the first verse of the 4th chapter of Genesis says that Adam lay with his wife Eve and she gave birth to Cain. Later they lay again and Eve brought forth Abel. Cain was a farmer and Abel was a shepherd. They both presented offerings to God. Cain brought forth some of the fruits of the soil. Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of the flock. God looked with favor on the offerings of Abel and not with favor on the offerings of Cain. The Bible says that Cain was very downcast, very angry, and his face was downcast. And the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you would just do what's right, sin is crouching at your door and waiting to master you." God is clear that the lack of responsibility for favor in regards to his offering was Cain's responsibility and not God's or Abel's or anyone else's. And if Cain was not careful, then sin would master him because it was crouching at his door. One day, Cain invited his brother to a field, and the Bible says he murdered his brother. Cain did not get home safe. Right after the fall into sin in the garden in Genesis, we have the first murder. And we have been murdering each other ever since. After the murder, God says to Cain, "Where's your brother?" Cain says, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And then God says, "What is this thing that thou hast done? What is this evil? What is this senseless and ridiculous act that thou hast committed? What is this abomination? What is this crime? Did you think I would not see it? Do you think you could hide? Did you think it would be the end of it with Abel lying in a pool of blood on the ground?" And then God speaks one of the most profound scriptures in the Bible. God says, "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." In response to the cries of the blood, God says to Cain, "Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opens its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." God places Cain under a curse, and the curse means first that the ground that opens its mouth to receive Abel's blood, and the ground is so reviled, and the ground is so repulsed that it will not cooperate with Cain. It will not yield its crops for you, God says. The ground had been yielding its fruit to Cain without labor. But because of what he has done, he will now have to labor. Second, Cain will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Cain will not have a home. He's taken away a home from his brother, and neither would he have a place. In response to the curse from God, Cain pleads with God and asks for leniency in verses 13 through 14. Cain says to the Lord that he cannot bear his punishment. He says, in being driven from the land and being hidden from God's presence, and as a wanderer, whoever finds me will kill me. Cain fears people will treat him just as he treated his brother. The Lord hears his cry for leniency and says in verse 15, not so. If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. God will stop the hand because somebody was going to kill Cain to avenge Abel, and somebody was going to kill the one that killed Cain to avenge, and the cycle of violence would continue. God desires for the killing and the violence to stop. God desires for the killing and the violence to stop. Cain then leaves the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The word Nod means wandering. Cain lived in wandering somewhere east of Eden. In the land of wandering east of Eden, Cain lay with his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain built a city, and then he named it after his son Enoch. Cain was able to find a wife and then be blessed with a son. Maybe Cain could learn to be family again. Cain founded a city, networks of people and family relationships, kids and grandkids, and enough to found a city. Cain seems to have found a measure of being restored. God was lenient, merciful. A murderer was not murdered. One who showed no mercy to his brother was shown mercy. The one who violated the covenant of family received a covenant and a family from God. The one who did not protect his brother was protected. The one who was judge, jury, and executioner did not receive the full measure of the sentencing that was due. This is a hard text for all of us because what we want is vengeance. I mean, Abel is not able to find a wife and found a city. Cain has a wife and a city, but Abel has none. Cain has children and grandchildren, but Abel has none. As a result, we want Cain to suffer. After all, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Those that live by the sword die by the sword. We want full punishment under the full measure of the law. We all want that. Except when our son or our father or our husband or our daughter or our wife or our mother is Cain. I mean, has anybody in your family ever done anything stupid? This is the grace of Almighty God. Many of us want God to kill Cain, not banish him, except, of course, when Cain is our child or Cain is our brother or we ourselves are Cain. We would be doing the same thing that Tiffany Van Dyke and the family is doing, pleading for mercy for the life of our husband and our father. This is the grace of Almighty God. What we do not often pay enough attention to is the families that have to deal with the reality of the murder. What did Mama Eve, the mother of Cain and Abel, feel when she found out that her son had been murdered, that he didn't get home safe, and on top of that, the murderer had been his brother? What did she feel when she sat at the funeral? Did she make remarks, or was she just silent? What did Daddy Adam feel? Did he collapse when he received the news? When he heard that two brothers were going out together, he knew they were going to get home safe. How did he get over this? Or did he ever get over it? I mean, he had no idea that fights in the backyard between two boys could one day lead to murder. Murder is very complex. When we notice the families responding and trying to deal with the murder of Laquan McDonald, you know it is complicated. You have one family, the Van Dyke family, in their pain and hurt, pleading for leniency and grace and mercy. You have another family, the McDonalds, who in their pain are seeking justice to the full extent of the law. It's easy to stake out simplistic positions. It's very difficult to look at both sides of this issue. Murder is very complex. Murder is a complicated thing. Families are casualties of murder. Realizing the complexity of all sides, the judge gave a sentence. And his opening remarks were, "No one is going to be happy with my sentencing." The judge called the case a tragedy for both sides. The judge agreed with the defense to sentence Van Dyke on the second-degree murder charge alone. The judge was lenient and gave him 6 years and 9 months in prison, to which the McDonald family was outraged and even more deeply grieved. They wept bitterly at the prospect that a police officer kills their family member and all he gets is 7 years. They asked the question, what is the value of a black life in America? With credit for good behavior, Van Dyke will likely only serve around 3 years for firing 16 bullets into Laquan McDonald. The Van Dyke family and their attorneys were ecstatic and said so in a press conference. Ecstatic that they were going to see their father and their husband in potentially 3 years. I wish that they would not have been so ecstatic. I wish they would have been quiet and just went home. Murder is a complex thing. I wish they'd have gone home and kept their joy to themselves, because the family of Laquan McDonald will never see their child or their brother. And so what are we left with? Some of us agree with the McDonald family, and some of us agree with the Van Dyke family. What are we left with? What I am left with is this: God will take care of Abel. In a time that I do not know, a place I do not know, God will make Abel whole. God has already taken care of Cain. He has the mark of Cain, so no one can kill him, and though he is a wanderer, he gets a family and a city. The judge takes care of Van Dyke. He gets leniency and will see his kids and family again. He will get the chance to rebuild his life. The police officer family will take the financial care of the Van Dyke family. God will take care of Laquan McDonald. Like Abel, he is in God's hand. And God will one day open our eyes to what happens to all the victims of murder. Something beautiful and wonderful, I believe. The city took care financially of the Laquan McDonald family with a financial settlement. But really, does money replace a child? Who then will really take care of the family of Laquan McDonald? In God's name, it is us. We will, because we will fight that there not be any more Laquan McDonalds. In the name of God, it is our job to change this system, to elect people that will change this system, to elect judges and district attorneys and get police officers to change this system. Maybe if we could change the system, we could help there be less Jason Van Dykes and fewer Laquan McDonalds. The system that we have is not working, and for the sake of Laquan McDonald and Jason Van Dyke and their families, it is up to you and me to change the system. If you and I would get together and change things, what would be our goal? I can only tell you what would be my goal. That everybody gets home safe. That black kids get home safe. And police officers get home safe. Maybe we could realize that for every black kid that gets shot and killed, it is less safe for police. And for every police officer that is shot and killed, black people are less safe. Do you know what the family of Jason Van Dyke wanted that night? Do you know what they really wanted? For Jason Van Dyke to get home safe. You know what the family of Laquan McDonald wanted that night? For Laquan McDonald to get home safe. For Cain to no longer kill Abel is up to you and me to take care, to vote, get on these police boards, to get busy, get active, lest there be more Jason Van Dykes and more Laquan McDonalds. How many more Jason Van Dykes and Laquan McDonalds? How many more Cains will kill Abel? In Jesus' name, amen. Whew. Let's talk about the sermon. Where's my mic person? Yes. Yes, I went clear. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you so much again. His heart is very full after hearing what you just preached. So the floor is open. Questions for Dr. Thomas about the sermon?
So what I hope is what I explained up front was actually in practice on the back. That's African American preaching at its best. So let's talk. What did you hear? Let's talk about it. And I want to come back to this question, your question of rage, because I want to ask you, if anywhere, did you hear my rage, or did you hear my rage? What did you? Can we start with that question?
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Put me on the spot, all right?
No, I mean, what did you hear rage?
Well, I think so. I mean, and in a sense, you performed it with rhetorical questions that made us feel, or at least hope that we would feel the pain of loss. And then when you ask those rhetorical questions about the family of Van Dyke, being able to have him come home or even advocate on his behalf, that felt like you expressing anger in a sense of how dare they be looking for that kind of solution and not see what just happened. So in a sense, I felt it without it being expressed explicitly as anger.
Yeah. Anybody else? So yes. You got one up here. I have a response.
Say your name.
Two things that really, really spoke to me strongly. The way you used volume, tempo, and passion. When you first started speaking, you're very measured, quiet, logical. I almost was a little worried at first. But that created such a beautiful contrast because as you started to build tempo and passion, it just put so much depth into it. I also heard a lot of empathy that although calling out the object of the rage, recognize its universality. The third thing, you use some really classic terms that I associate with lament, like in the Psalms. How many more? Just like how long? That pulled, having the scriptural tradition as we do, if we share that, it brings us into that universal experience and helps us to empathize.
That's insightful, both of you.
There's one- okay.
Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
No, it's all right.
I heard the pain of a mother on both sides, losing an Abel, my baby, and then losing Cain, my baby. So I heard the pain on both sides, the pleading when Cain is your son. And to be able to relate to that as an African mother, seeing that in my community time and time and time again. So there was this strong connection. That's what I heard as a woman of color.
Thank you. My rage is all over that. I was here in Chicago the day this sentence. Matter of fact, I was in Chicago the day that the tapes were released, and then I was in Chicago the day the sentence went down, and I was completely outraged. I was just completely outraged. How many more times? How can you keep killing black kids? Why do you have to shoot somebody 17 times? So I just rage pushed me, and then I had to do something constructive with the rage, or it'll consume me. So what I hope that you heard was constructive rage, because when I read the transcripts, and I'm looking at the Van Dyke family, it hit me that if my son had gotten into trouble, I'd be right on that stand doing what she's doing, pleading with the judge to have mercy on him. That made it human. I still got the rage, but I got humanity, right? So I'm weaving all, then I got the biblical text standing out there, and then God was lenient. The judge was lenient, God was lenient, right? So should I have a problem with God? Because Cain gets to have a city, but Abel don't have no city. Anybody else? So all that got triggered when you said, what do I do with my rage? I'm trying to make it constructive. That's what I'm trying to do.
Paul, do you have anyone online with any questions? Okay. Okay.
So you are trying to be constructive.
Yes.
For those of us who are not at that phase yet.
Go ahead, yes.
Because I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, okay, everything he's saying, it's right, it's godly. I am not there. It makes me think of when the AME Baptist, when the church, when Dylan Rolfe came into the church, and then the movie that was done a year ago came out, and how some people were ready to forgive and would welcome him back in, and other people were like, no way, no how. I'm not, my sister died that day, etc. And then a woman that I love and respect in the covenant who is a black leader, she's like, I think sometimes we forgive too quickly. And I'm like, okay, I can go with this. And so I guess, obviously, I want to be constructive. I want to be forgiving most days. But to get to that point, I feel like you have to suspend a part that just says, how long? It's been too long. We're always, it seems anyway, the first ones that have to forgive, or the ones that consistently are being put upon to. And so I guess I'm just in a different place in this, and not entirely constructive, but just, and maybe feeling okay with that. So that's not a question, that's just a thought.
So thank you for that. I did this, I wrote this for Riverside Church in New York City. Amy Butler was a pastor, and she said there are some texts that we want to grapple with when you have trouble with God, with God's behavior. We want to give you this Cain and Abel text, because we've been studying it in Bible class, and we think we have a problem with God being lenient. So I took it, friend of mine said what you said, that they weren't there yet, and that it felt like the sermon was quashing rage, that it was squashing it, not releasing it, which I didn't have a problem with because the issue is so complex that anybody's response to it, as long as you ain't cussing me out, you have a right to that response. But I think that I have the struggle with stuffing the rage, trying to move forward, if we don't build a world for everywhere. So some of what I say is, can we build a sermon that looks at both sides? So we'll preach, for example, rich man and Lazarus, and we'll beat up the rich man and put the rich man in hell. When I say the rich man is making an evangelistic call, the rich man say, can you go back and tell my brothers so that they don't end up down here? So how do we see both sides? And what you said to me is 100% true. I'm not dismissing it. I think it's sometimes my temperament and how I reckon other folks will take the same text and they're ready to burn something down. I mean, I don't know. The rage would eat me alive if I didn't move. It just would. Any other comments? This is.
Right here? Okay.
My name's Debbie. So I was at this Uptown People's Law Center a couple days after. I'm not comparing these cases at all, so don't get me wrong, but after the college scandal and the woman got like 2 weeks in jail or whatever, and the gentleman that was giving the presentation, he's like, well, did you feel outraged? But he was asking us, did you feel outraged that she got such a lenient sentence? And he said, well, I just don't think, I don't think she should go to prison at all because I don't think prison's a good idea. But all of a sudden, when we're faced with these questions of vengeance or of people getting what's coming to them, all of a sudden we want prison to be this answer that we don't think is a good answer. But all of a sudden, we're like, but you should go there, even though we don't think that's a good place or a just system.
Right.
So when you were talking about this case, I thought about that again and like, oh, I did want him to go longer. But I also really don't think it's a good system. And I wish it didn't exist. So why do I want someone to go there at all? Anyway, that was my thought.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Any other comments, questions? Anything online yet, Paul?
While you're coming, let me add this comment. I preached this in a black church last June. And the rage in that room, until I got to, what if that was your son or your daughter? And it switched. There was so much rage. So when she said he was just doing his job, why you? I'm an uprising. I thought, So when you're dealing with an African American community and you're not willing to deal with this issue, you're not dealing with us, because this is one of the prima facie issues that people are scared to death at a police stop. Scared if you got male children. I got a 40-year-old son. It's a nightmare. So the rage, again, back to this question. Yes.
I was reminded of a sermon this summer that was preached at the Women's Conference for the Covenant Church. Romelia Williams preached on belonging, and it was very tense. She was speaking of the ways of belonging, and she was naming these instances of white women calling the police on, you know, people they thought that didn't belong. And at a moment, I could see people just, they were like, if they could shrink into the floor because it was uncomfortable. And there's a moment she paused and she said, I want to remind you that I'm in the text right now. And what was bringing mind to me is this is a passage where you can't question or not that we're in the text. You know, somebody's blood is crying out to the ground, you know, from the ground. And I just was, I was thinking about people that are not willing to go there and directly relating what's going on today with stories and situations in the text. I don't think making people more comfortable, I don't think we're supposed to be comfortable, but ways in which that art of dealing with things, how it seems it's easier to do that with certain scriptures and situations than others, and just how to navigate doing that well as a preacher, if that makes sense.
It does. It makes complete sense. It does. So, to be in a community and not address the community's concern, I mean, how could you not address it? I guess, how could you not? I don't know, I just can't not.
Yeah, and maybe it's part of that question of liberation, because there's people that they just don't want to go to, like, that's not the same. You know, scripture is separate from what's going on. You know, the Bible story about the rich man, that's not.
Yeah, that's it.
Be the rich man.
Yeah.
And so that's just what was brought to mind is when people really don't want to go there, but that's, how could you not?
Jason Van Dyke.
Question here?
Yes.
Yeah, how you doing?
Hi.
When I first heard you preaching the sermon, right, and you asked the question, the first thing I was thinking about was how being in a church, listening to that right after he got killed. You know what I mean? And I was like, wow, you know, because I was like, I could feel the rage. Now I'm going to give a real quick testimony on how I felt because you asked the question, how did your sermon make me feel, right? Real quick. But I was just released from prison, right, last year after I had a natural life sentence, right? And the governor granted my clemency from the point that, you know, he gave me 70 years. When he gave me 70 years, I had already 30 in. Now, when he granted my clemency, I was highly upset. I was peeved. And 3 days later, he granted my clemency on January 11th. 3 days later, the verdict came for Jason Van Dyke. So everybody in prison, they mad at me. It's a blessing, you just got out of here. But they not understanding. And when that happened, that really made me mad because I was like, I didn't kill anybody and I did 30 years. And this guy just outright murdered this guy and he get 3 years. So it goes back to what you was talking about justice and all of that there. So in the different level playing field. So, you know, I just wanted to put that thought out there. You know?
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
There's one in the back, right in the back.
Oh, yes. Thanks.
Hi, so my name is Mackenzie Mann, and I'm an MDiv student here. And I actually just wrote my master's thesis on looking at some women preachers throughout history, and I used your book, How to Preach a Dangerous Sermon, as the framework that I ran all the women through. So it was fun to see your name and also a little intimidating. But one of the things that I really love about your book is you talk that dangerous sermons are ones that speak truth to both the oppressor and the oppressed and call out both the injustice and the hatred that can stem from that injustice on both sides. And I would just love to hear more. It kind of ties into Dennis's earlier questions about rage and how do you speak with rage in a way that's constructive, but I would just love to hear more about how you feel like preachers can speak to both oppressor and oppressed in a way that actually inspires action, because I think that so often when I try to do that, I just end up straddling the middle and saying, oh, well, neither of us are great, but I don't know where to go from here.
I think you'll get there because you've started the quest. There's some things, for example, that flower when you're 50 that you started when you were 20. But if you don't start when you're 20 and you start when you're 50, you don't get there. So the kind of broadness, the experience, the prayer, the dealing with all kinds of people across time, being open to having a brother like Klein from Appalachia, and we talk, to a friend in South Africa, and we talk. I mean, real talk. Or, you know, my womanist sisters, we talk. So I think that if you connect with enough diverse people across time and you listen to their stories, it builds something in you that gets expressed like what you heard. So I think that you're on it. Just keep going, keep listening. I don't know that I could have preached that sermon when I was 20 or when I first started pastoring. That has come through, I've been preaching for 35 years, to be able to stand up in front of an audience and hold that thing together, so that, you know, it's like we're on the edge here, and if the preacher makes a mistake, we all gonna fall off, right? So I'm holding everybody together, and it's experience, wisdom, time, God's grace. So I say stay on the journey, and I think you have to love everybody and want to see the best for everybody. And I love my group. There's no doubt about it. I love my group. You know, the whole first thing is you know, black preaching. I love my group. But there's something also fundamental in me that I don't want for my child and not want for your child. If I want my child to get home safe, why wouldn't I want your child to get home safe? I mean, so I have a sermon called Tribal Gods around the sheep and the goat. Jesus is going to separate them because most people are serving a tribal God, the God of our tribe. But what if you served a God beyond the tribe? That God might look at both sides, or push us to look at both sides. So I was doing, for the Episcopalians, they invited me to do a preaching class. And it was one of these particularly dark days where I don't know what was happening with the government, with Trump, but it was a down day. It was a very down day. And so we were talking. It was an hour-and-a-half drive from the airport to the retreat center, so we were talking. So I was talking and pouring it out. And he said to me, you sound like you don't have any hope. I said, if I didn't have hope, I wouldn't be showing up here. I'm getting ready to talk to some white Episcopalians. Despite my rage, despite I'm angry, I'm still here. My showing up is my hope. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but it came up in me to say, so I said it. But that may have nothing to do with what you just said to me. But regardless how you feel, you still show up. No matter how mad you are. That's like a marriage, just like a relationship. No matter how angry you are, if it's going to work, you have to show up one more time. So I keep showing up, despite how angry I am.
Any other questions, comments?
So I think keep showing up. So in the book, you know, I do 4 things, right? What are the 4? This is a quiz. No, you told me you read the book, right? So what's the first thing? What's the first characteristic of moral imagination?
You talk about having sermons that embody and speak to justice, that have empathy for both the oppressor and the oppressed, that use sources of wisdom, and that also use art and poetry.
Exactly, you caught it. You have to show up. A lot of people don't show up. We have people who pontificate on behalf of people in neighborhoods they've never been in. They don't know the first thing about that neighborhood. They've never been there, and they're pontificating what these people need. They never showed up. You got to show up. You got to put your physical presence in the place where suffering is. And when you show up, well, there's 4 steps in the book, so I was just reemphasizing showing up. So,
my name's Dick Luco. I'm kind of a retired pastor.
Okay.
And I've been thinking about the fact that how would that sermon go in a white church where there's some group of people who are pretty well defended and don't want to deal with the issue and would say, well, if he only would have done what the policeman told him to do, etc. And I think it was a masterful, if those folks are going to be able to think about the issue beyond that and talk about it, the sermon would give them the best chance to do that. And so I thought it was a masterful job to perhaps open conversation where it is very difficult to open conversation.
So what was the particular point? I have my own guess, but what was the particular point that you think might open up dialogue for them?
Well, the whole thing, but the one line that keeps going through my head is when black kids are shot, policemen are less safe. When policemen are shot, black kids are less safe.
Right. So we don't. So we do either or. We don't connect those. Right. So if you over there, if y'all would just obey the law, you wouldn't have a problem. But right. It's on YouTube. I did it at Riverside Church, New York City. It's on YouTube, and in front of Riverside, I did this whole piece. It was my first time doing it, so I did this whole piece on I'm not against the police. I'm against abuse. I'm against clergy who abuse. I'm against police officers who abuse, nurses that abuse, teachers. I'm against abuse. But after that time, I said, it is what it is. Let's go.
Hi,
Yes.
Michelle. You asked how we received your sermon, and I found myself being formed in actual time. And the example I am giving is so you know, because we talked at dinner, that I'm a prison abolitionist too, like my friend Debbie, probably. And, but when you announced the sentence, and I'm also sitting next to my friend Smiley, and when you said, okay, and they announced the sentence 3 years, and I just, like, my whole body started shaking my head. And then you said, right, we want revenge in this way. And this is not to say that there needs to be restoration and healing and some serious work with Jason Van Dyke, but that my response to Van Dyke's sentence was blocking me and separating me from Jason Van Dyke, when in the story, my body is in the place of Jason Van Dyke's. It's not in the place of Laquan McDonald's. It's not in the place of Smiley. And so I just found myself, because of your words and because you were pulling us along so beautifully and so clearly and in tempo, and that I was being formed in the moment and becoming more aware of my own sinful barriers. And thank you for helping liberate me in that moment. And the work then of white liberation is that white people need to be dealing with white people and sitting with white people in this, like the rich man from hell saying, don't be here like me.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Anything else fall in line? Nothing? Okay.
I'm trying to think, do I have any final reflections about
Yes.
it? It's a dangerous sermon. And I don't think that you can preach like that every week and survive it. But every now and then, somebody ought to say something that's dangerous. I don't advocate every Sunday preaching like that. You can't get away with it. They'll have you alive. They'll fry you. But there are times when we have to stand up. And I hope that I have a book coming out. It's called Surviving a Dangerous Sermon. No, it's really a trilogy. There's a third one called The God of the Dangerous Sermon, but I'm at 2 right now. I got that title because as I lectured across the country about this, people say, I want to preach like that, but how will I survive it? I want to preach like this, but how will I survive it? And so I wrote a book, How to Survive. This is what you can do to survive. And I say, before you preach it, make sure you understand the other side. If you only understand one side and you get up and preach it, that's going to increase the odds. Have you talked to somebody on the other side? You need to balance. A friend of mine said that. He says, I never heard a social justice sermon that took both sides. Okay. Usually, and sometimes rightfully so, we take one side. How do I see the other side? Maybe I got to hang out with some people on the other side. Maybe I got to make some friends on the other side. Maybe I got to step over barriers. Maybe I got to find friends that on the other side that can hear my rage. And I can hear their apathy, and maybe both of us move. Maybe I know that in liberation thought, we say God is on our side. We used to say that, yes. When the folks say that, it was God who put Trump in office. Well, we said that about Barack Obama. Only in a white America, only God could put Trump and Obama in office. We said the same thing. I don't know. I'm just pontificating. What if God's on both sides? I don't know. What if both groups are God's children? What if God is saying, even a murderer Cain is still my child? So, with that, thank you all so much.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Thomas, so very much for a dangerous lecture and a dangerous sermon, for showing up for us and for offering us hope.